Hey there. I just wanted to make a quick point about nationalism. So, in my class, we talk a lot about nationalism, and it is one of the most important political ideologies that emerges in the 19th century. Uh, Before the 19th century, there was basically the word nation was used, but the idea of the nation being a driving political idea was not on the map. And it took a lot of leaders in the world by storm or by surprise when it popped up. So the basic idea in nationalism is that all the people in the world are divided up into distinct groups of people called nations. This is the first belief. The second belief is that these nations need to be self-governing, that it is messed up for people from one nation to rule over people from another nation. Um, so these are the two key beliefs. There are lots of nations in the world, and each nation deserves to be autonomous. Now, why does a nation need to be autonomous? That's a good question. How do you decide who is in which nation? What nation are you? Those are both big questions, and different nationalists answer those questions differently. So what I wanted to talk about today was to talk about different ways that nationalists have attempted to define who belongs to a particular nation. And in a lot of ways, this is a question of identity. How does a particular person identify themselves? But also it has a question with how you identify other people. And very frequently, one person can feel like they belong to one nation, but somebody else might think they belong to a different nation. So how can you define who is in which nation? There are basically three different types of nationalism, and they disagree about how you decide who belongs to which nation. So they are liberal nationalism, cultural nationalism, and biological nationalism. And in that order, they kind of go from the most inclusive to the least inclusive forms of nationalism. So let's start with liberal nationalism. To a lot of people, this sounds like a contradiction. Liberalism and nationalism, especially in the American sense of liberal, seem to go against each other. Liberals are often considered to be like cosmopolitan or anti-nationalist in American discourse. But the the main idea of liberal nationalism doesn't really have a lot to do with that. What liberal nationalism means is that people from different parts of the world can all come together and be part of a nation, because a nation is decided not by where you come from or your religion or your race. Your nation is determined solely by the political principles that you live by. Some people call liberal nationalism civic nationalism, because your identity within a nation is determined solely by your loyalty to a set of political principles. And there are a lot of very important examples of liberal nationalism. Perhaps the best example is the United States. The United States is a nation, or some would say maybe not a nation, but civic nationalists would say that it was a nation composed of people from all over the world who have accepted certain basic ideas about what sort of country they want to live in. So that would include the rule of law, believing in the Constitution and the representative process, as well as accepting basic like property rules and stuff like that. So to be a member of America, you don't. In this reading of the idea of civic nationalism, the only thing you have to do is accept a certain number of key civic ideas, and so that is one reason, for example, why we have to, or if you want to become a citizen, you have to demonstrate some knowledge of how the American governmental system works. The basic idea is that citizens of the United States are buying into a system and thereby becoming a member of the nation. Another important example of civic nationalism is France during the French Revolution and afterwards. France was actually a very diverse country that spoke lots of different languages. But what they had in common was the experience of going through the French Revolution, which again was based on certain ideals, specifically liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And the French nation formed around these ideas, this idea of progress and the brotherhood of man. So both the United States and France are really great examples of this type of nationalism. You could come up with a lot more examples if you wanted, but I feel like that's good. So let's move on to the next type of nationalism, which is cultural nationalism, sometimes called linguistic nationalism or ethnic nationalism. But the basic idea here behind cultural nationalism is that people don't really choose their nations, but rather that nations form naturally over hundreds or even thousands of years as different groups of people who are connected to each other but isolated from other groups of people form shared traditions, shared ideas, shared ways of life, and perhaps most importantly, shared languages. And the idea here is that different groups of people will have different values and will develop into basically unique specimens of humanity. So, for example, people who live high in the mountains, whose ancestors thousands of years ago were hunters or maybe herders, will develop very different types of cultures and expectations and different languages than people who grow up maybe down the mountains, living in the fertile plains where you farm and develop cities and stuff like that. Just the modes of life are totally different. And so over time, people who live in agricultural areas, say, I don't know, like Mesopotamia or the Egypt, the Nile Delta region, will develop one type of culture, whereas people who live in the mountains, say in Lebanon or wherever, those aren't very good examples, who herd sheep will develop different ways of doing things. Now, the idea is that today those traditions and linguistic remnants and ways of life persist and have shaped the people who live in these different regions. And that these different groups should not be forced to live together. So for example, if the people from the rich farming areas take over the mountainous areas and then rule over the herding people, many cultural nationalists would say that is bad, that is imperialism, because these are two different groups of people who both deserve to exist and should be protected. So what cultural nationalists would call for would be some sort of basically like non-aggression pact between different nations. So like the two different nations should recognize each other as separate entities and let each nation do its own thing. It would be wrong for the herding nation to try and rule the farmers, just as it would be wrong for the farmers to try and rule the herding nation. And what a lot of early cultural nationalists, guys like Giuseppe Mazzini or the early German nationalist Herder, they imagined some kind of brotherhood of nations where every nation, big or small, gets their own little region and does their own thing. And there'd be no reason for any nation to try and take over anybody else. Why would you want to rule over anybody else if you had all of your people together? That was their idea. Now, the last type of nationalism is the one that develops latest. Liberal nationalism developed during the Enlightenment and emerged in the late 1700s. Cultural nationalism developed in the early 1800s, largely in response to France taking over other parts of Europe. So for example, when France took over Germany, a lot of Germans said, hey, we're kind of different, we speak a different language, we do things differently, we don't want you to rule us. Biological nationalism develops only in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And one reason for this is that its ideas are based on Darwinian evolution. The idea that you pass down certain key biological characteristics through your genes, through your blood. Basically, biological nationalism could also be called racial nationalism. And this idea said that not only did different groups of people living in different areas develop different ways of life and different traditions, but they actually evolved into different subspecies of humanity. And that basically there's no way for one individual from one nation to ever become a member of another nation, because you can't change your genes. You could change your language, your dress, your modes of behavior, but there's no way that you can change your genetics, and not even your children have a chance. And if somebody from one nation was to enter another nation and then have children in that nation, what that would mean is it would not result in a new kid for that nation, but actually the mixing of two nations, because the nation, according to biological nationalism, is in your blood. And this sort of nationalism you see emerge in the United States South with the formation of the KKK, who considered basically white Protestants to be the only true Americans. And anybody who did not meet those parameters was considered to be an enemy of the nation. All they could do was erase or pollute the American genetic heritage by breeding with members of that nation. This idea also, you're probably already thinking it, was the basic idea behind Nazism. One of the main reasons that Nazis were afraid or hated other races was because they were afraid that their race, which they considered to be the best, was going to be polluted by invaders from other races. Specifically, Jews were targeted because they had adopted German culture. Many German Jews spoke German, dressed exactly the same, participated in all the same activities. And so the Nazis were especially afraid of Jews because they had basically completely assimilated into German life and were marrying Christian women and having kids. And the Nazis believed that this was polluting the nation. So anyway, you've got three different types of nationalism. And they go from being kind of maybe even widely accepted to being totally taboo and upsetting. And one reason I think that nationalism is poorly understood in a lot of political discourse is people fail to distinguish between different types of nationalism. So liberal nationalism can be really effective. It's a good way of getting large groups of diverse people to work together towards a common goal. That's the main idea in the United States. And very frequently, by appealing to the founding ideas of the United States of equality and progress, people have been able to do a lot of really good things by pulling people together to all work towards common ideas. Another thing that's not so bad about civic nationalism is that anybody can join. As long as you're willing to buy into a system, you can become a member of the nation. So like the United States has integrated for over 200 years tons and tons of people from every conceivable part of the world into a single effective civic unit. That's civic nationalism. Cultural nationalism is harder because it takes longer to adopt the norms and customs of a place you move to. But even in civic nationalism, it's possible and really not crazy for people to integrate into a new society. Or even if those people don't, maybe their kids will be fully integrated according to cultural nationalism. The reason that biological nationalism is so scary is it's impossible for anybody ever to join the nation without messing it up. And that is why biological nationalism is such a dangerous idea. It makes every other nation look like a threat. Yeah, anyway, so that's three different types of nationalism. Nationalism is a fascinating and complicated subject, and I'll probably post more videos about it. Thanks.